Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Bernice van Bronckhorst. I am the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. So welcome to today's event on greening the recovery from COVID-19, focusing on how national climate ambition can be harnessed to shape a sustainable and resilient recovery. We will be recording today's event and it will be available for replay. So please do share your thoughts with us on Twitter using the hashtag #FastForwardClimateAction. We are particularly proud to host this event just 2 days before the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. 5 years ago, countries came together with a bold starting point. While the Paris Agreement was not enough to limit the worst effects of climate change, parties to the agreement took key steps in the right direction with the expectation of renewing ambition every 5 years. So, of course, November 2020 was to have been a pivotal moment, but as we all know, this past year has been unprecedented and the COP was postponed to next November in Glasgow. But every country has been immersed in responding to the global health and economic crisis triggered by the pandemic. However, countries now have a once in a generation opportunity to ensure that their recovery plans not only steer them out of the pandemic, but can also help their citizens be better prepared for other shocks, including the impacts of climate change. So how can countries translate this vision of a green recovery into next steps? What are the policy wins and early investments that countries can undertake now to ensure a green recovery? And how can the World Bank support these efforts and fast forward climate action for our clients? So these are some of the questions we hope to address in today's discussion. And to kick it off, let me introduce our first panel. We are absolutely delighted to have them join us today to launch a new flagship trust fund at the World Bank, which will focus on greening the recovery. So welcome to our first speakers. We have Mari Pangestu, who's the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank. And we're hoping also to be joined by Minister Martin Jaeger, State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. So let me start with Mari, who will announce the World Bank's new Multidonor Trust Fund and present how the bank can deploy it to support our clients with a green recovery. So thank you, Mari, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Bernice. Thank you for inviting me to speak and to launch our new program. And it's good to be here with Minister Jaeger. I see that he has joined, and with other panelists. I think we are all aware that the pandemic has had a devastating impact on lives, livelihoods, and economies. But we also know that helping countries recover from this shock alone will not be enough if they remain unprepared to deal with future crises like climate change, which we know was already a big issue, big crisis before the pandemic. And now actually it can be accentuated with the pandemic. And we will know that climate change will hit the poorest, the hardest, and including those living in the context of fragility, conflict, and violence. In fact, the World Bank's most recent Poverty and Shared Prosperity report looked at the impact of three C's: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and conflict, and estimated that the combination of all three will push an additional 150 million into extreme poverty by 2021. Therefore, it's critical that as countries think about their plan for recovery, this building back better opportunity, that they really deploy investments to also help their citizens to be better prepared for these other shocks. Through the bank's COVID response, we are targeting, as you know, 160 billion of investment and policy financing that will help support a green, I always say green and blue. So I know when we say green, we mean the whole climate action, but I come from an ocean-based country, so I always say green and blue, inclusive and resilient recovery. But how can we leverage this funding and bring together our ambitious climate efforts in a way that enhances targets for lending, increases financing for adaptation and resilience, and helps our clients chart a sustainable future? I'm very pleased to be able to share with you that we will be launching a new trust fund, the Climate Support Facility, on December 12th, the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. This new facility will be dedicated to supporting countries to shape a green and blue recovery and align these efforts with their short and long-term climate plans. The facility, capitalized as of now with $52 million from our partners in Germany, the UK, and Austria, will advance action on multiple fronts. Let me just highlight three that we see as transformative. First, by ensuring that green recovery approaches have country ownership. For instance, by helping our clients develop macroeconomic models that help incorporate climate into national budgets, enhancing NDCs, and supporting long-term strategies. Second, by ensuring technical expertise is deployed where it's most needed. This includes embedding specialized economic advisors in key government ministries to assist with climate-informed national recovery strategies. And third, by generating high-impact analytical work that can support government decision-making. I think this is really key. Evidence-based policymaking can really help governments make the right decisions. This includes the impact of COVID-19 on carbon emissions and the effect of climate policies on jobs and livelihoods. The policymakers need to say, this is not just good for climate, but it is also good for jobs and livelihoods. Let me close on that note and hand it back to you, Bernice.
Thank you very much, Mari, for your excellent comments. So I would now like to hand it over to the State Secretary Martin Jaeger and ask him to share his remarks on why Germany is supporting the Climate Support Facility and the Green Recovery Initiative, which will be funded under the new facilities to help countries build a low carbon climate resilient recovery from COVID-19. So over to you, State Secretary.
Yeah, thank you, Bernice. Thank you, Mari. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues and friends, guests. I was just struggling with some technical issues, and I hope that it now works and plays out well. Thank you for having me. I'm very glad and honored to participate in the launch of the Green Recovery Initiative today. 2020 has been a year of immense challenges. The global pandemic, together with the climate crisis and increasing extreme weather events, have become the ingredients of a mix of compounding risks for our partner countries. Progress made on the SDGs has been massively impacted. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, it is likely that up to 150 million people, more people, will fall into extreme poverty. And the number of people who will be in need of direct food aid has nearly doubled in the last 12 months. But there are signs of hope and optimisms too. To counteract the enormous impacts of the pandemic, governments have pledged almost $12 trillion in fiscal stimulus in response to the COVID-19 health and economic crisis. However, how these investments are used will be crucial for development pathways for decades to come. And in particular, these decisions will be crucial for effectively addressing the climate crisis, for not missing the boat when it comes to setting the course on climate neutrality and resilience. If we do not get it right now, not in the future, now, path dependencies of investment cycles and uncertain policy environments will jeopardize our chances of reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. The good news is that we can bring two aspects together, economic recovery on the one hand and sustainability of recovery efforts on the other. This will not only help us in tackling the climate crisis, but will also allow us to reap additional benefits in terms of innovation, future-proof jobs, and truly sustainable growth. With this very end in mind, we have partnered with the World Bank Group, the UK, and Austria to set up a new green recovery initiative that will support the bank's efforts to anchor climate action in its recovery and emergency response programs. Germany is providing 35 million euros towards the climate support facility that will house this new initiative. And I'm really grateful to my colleagues from Austria and the UK for their contributions as well. Dear colleagues, dear friends, we find ourselves at a crossroads right now with a short window of opportunity left for fiscal and policy responses to the crisis to be crafted. We must make sure now that economic recovery plans are climate smart and SDG and Paris aligned. In order to do this successfully, we need close multilateral cooperation and alignment. So let me end with a word of gratitude to our partners in this initiative, which contributes to the feelings of hope with which we should look back towards the year 2021. Hopefully a year of green recovery and building back better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. And of course, again, just to say from the World Bank side, we are extremely grateful for Germany's very generous support of this new initiative, as well as, of course, the UK and Austria. So just to reiterate that. Mari, we just have a few minutes left of your time. So I wanted to just follow up on what State Secretary Jaeger just mentioned. Could you just in like 1 or 2 minutes think of what are some of the key entry points to align COVID recovery with climate action? And, I know you've had a lot of experience, of course, coming, to the World Bank from the government of Indonesia, but what are some clear, quick policy wins for bank clients that you could share with us?
Let me suggest 3 aspects that could be critical to the recovery and to ensuring, climate action. I think countries will find, first of all, they will find themselves with tighter fiscal constraints and rising debt. So there is an opportunity to actually reform harmful subsidies, such as fossil fuel subsidies, agriculture subsidies, and instead spend these resources more wisely. And with oil prices being low at this moment, it's a good time to do it. So on agriculture subsidies, our calculation shows $500 billion government spend on agriculture subsidies can actually be repurposed towards more climate smart and sustainable outcomes for our food systems. I myself, when I was in government, we did go through these fossil fuel reforms. They are not easy, but I think with political will, they can be done. Second, we have to support countries to move on their decarbonization strategies, especially as they invest in transport, energy, and new digital technology infrastructures. The good news is that low carbon stimulus programs can also drive new jobs that are sustainable, inclusive, and equitable. And we know that the technology now allows us to do so. And I really think this, I mentioned that earlier, that for policymakers, it's very important to be able to have the narrative that addressing low carbon is a win-win for both growth, jobs, and climate action. But for that, they need the analytical work. They need to be able to say what jobs would be created, including in the new industries and sectors like renewable energy, like in Myanmar, where we are seeing financing of solar home systems and LED lamps for households, as well as mini grids of solar PV. And it's not just about these households getting electricity, but the industry that is around these new industries will also create jobs. And I think I would like to see greater emphasis on nature-based solutions. investing in the restoration of degraded landscapes and seascapes could create many jobs. And it can be actually your, cash for work stimulus programs, creating jobs while in the recovery and in the short term. But it will also generate longer term benefits, because you will have better crop yields, better fish product yields, because you've improved the landscapes. Actually, Indonesia has a program on mangrove restoration, as well as a coral reef restoration as part of its stimulus program. And it's also in the coral reef situation. It's also linked to the tourism, the recovery of tourism. And it can also provide. You can also think about programs that can provide greater protection to avert natural disasters when they hit. So I think these are all really concrete programs that can achieve jobs, recovery, growth, as well as greater resilience for the future.
Thank you, Mari. That were some really excellent suggestions. Secretary Jaeger, let me go to you and ask you a very similar question. What key entry points would you like to see take shape over the next few months? You're on mute. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Bernice, for your question. I can fully align myself with what Mari has said. So these are important and really good suggestions. Let me add only three aspects from my side. First, I think we need to ensure that recovery efforts do not harm in terms of long-term sustainability, meaning no subsidies for harmful business models, no artificial lifelines for outdated fossil-based energy. This would only result in zombie firms and stranded assets. Second, and that's important, we need appropriate regulatory frameworks and investments in specific support for a green recovery. This is, for instance, a good moment for the phasing out of fossil subsidies. And when we talk about the World Bank, that would mean, or could mean in concrete terms, that the World Bank's DPOs can support sustainable recovery in a much more targeted way, for example, by mainstreaming the green aspect of recovery programs. The Green Recovery Initiative will make an important contribution in this regard. It will integrate climate risks into the macro fiscal analytical tools and operations used to design recovery programs. Debt relief can also support a sustainable and green recovery. And third and lastly, the upcoming IDA 19 midterm review should be used to discuss how to ensure that IDA supports a green, inclusive, and resilient recovery among IDA clients. We expect IDA to play a significant role in the crisis response while maximizing climate and SDG co-benefits. And on a last word, we believe that all support for recovery needs to be checked for untapped potential for stepping up climate action. We need to link the short-term emergency, this is what we do through our coronavirus response, with the longer-term but much bigger challenge of climate change, in order to emerge on a stronger, more resilient and sustainable footing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, again, I would really like to thank both Mari and State Secretary Jaeger for joining us today. And again, let's hope that in the months and years to come, we have more of these kinds of engagements where we can share some success stories from the Climate Support Facility with you. So with that, I'd now like to turn to our next panel. We have invited Helen Mountford, who is the Vice President for Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute, as well as Mr. Jongi Viti, who is the Chief Director for Climate Change Monitoring and Evaluation at the South African Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining us here today and talk a little bit about how green recovery strategies can work at the national level. So Helen, let me start with you. WRI recently published new analytical work that looks at previous experiences of greening the recovery during the financial crisis of 2008-2009. And you're also working on efforts to align NDCs and the green recovery. Could you tell us about some of the most promising innovations or policy wins for green recovery that you want to see happen at the country level?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bernice. And let me start by actually congratulating the World Bank and extending great thanks to Germany, the UK, and Austria for this new trust fund for greening the recovery. It is very much needed now, so wonderful to see that happening. Indeed, our new World Resources Institute report shows that for the economies that had the greenest stimulus in 2008-2009, such as the US, the Republic of Korea, China, and the EU, this actually helped them recover economically and also created jobs in the short term. In addition, in terms of the longer run impacts, we saw that some of those that really invested heavily in clean energy manufacturing and research and development helped them to build new industries for the future after the financial crisis, including very much the renewable energy boom, which we are now seeing the benefits of as we see renewables are increasingly cheaper than not just coal, but also natural gas in many countries around the world. Thus, for example, China's solar photovoltaic manufacturing capacity increased by a factor of 20-fold between 2000 and 2011, largely thanks to some of the stimulus they used tackling the great financial crisis. And similarly, we saw great results in the US in terms of domestic production of wind turbines, which then became a real growth industry for the US following the crisis. So we've seen both those short-term benefits and also some of those longer-term innovative benefits coming out of greening the recovery in the last financial crisis. Now, as we look to recover from the COVID-19 economic crisis, we need really right now to focus on projects that can be scaled up quickly and can create some of the short-term GDP and employment gains that countries are so desperately looking for. The good news is that some of these are also where countries can get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of enhancing their climate targets, including their 2030 nationally determined contributions, the NDCs or Paris targets that countries are being asked to update at the moment in the lead up to Glasgow COP26 in November next year. So a couple of quick examples here where we're seeing some real benefits coming forward. One, per dollar invested, investments in retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency and in renewable generation can actually lead to over double the amount of jobs as the same investment in either coal or gas. And this is according to a recent IEA and IMF report. So you'll get more jobs from clean energy and energy efficiency than from investing in new fossil fuels. Similarly, there's great evidence that developing public transport or walking and biking paths will actually generate more jobs than yet more building of roads. So an area where government should focus. And just picking up one of the points that Mary Pangestu made, there's a wealth of opportunities in terms of nature-based solutions as well. Restoring degraded agricultural forest lands, building up and restoring coastal zones, including through mangrove restoration. These can lead to boosting farmer and fisher income potential as well as a green recovery. So important opportunities there. In some ways, we're actually seeing the massive investments that countries are putting forward now towards the green recovery, towards an economic recovery, as an opportunity to really boost action on climate, accelerating it beyond what we even thought was possible a year ago because of these big investments. And it's so wonderful to see that the World Bank is here supporting countries to identify some of those opportunities for green and blue recovery, and one that is jobs rich, inclusive, and resilient. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks for remembering the blue recovery, not just the green recovery. So with that, let me now turn to Mr. Witty. We all know that there can be a huge difference between thinking about or discussing policy and, on the other hand, actually implementing it in the real world. So what do you see are some of the key elements to making a green recovery possible at the operational level?
Thank you, Benis. Let me also say good welcome to everyone. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. If you look at many recovery plans that countries have produced thus far, one of the key things, especially for developing countries, one of the key things we observe is the need for public-private partnerships, because a lot of developing countries are not able to, to finance most of the intervention. So that is one key ingredient that needs to be considered. But also for developing countries, the idea of localization of technology, greening technologies is another important consideration, because it helps with the triple problem that most developing countries face, the issue of poverty, inequality and unemployment. So it's at the core of some of the strategies that needs to be considered. Then, of course, institutional setups. So we view institutional setups in two ways. Some of at a much more policy level, you do need a policy structure that's going to oversee implementation, so that you get a wide range of views from different stakeholders. So some governments are actually forming such structures like Commission of Climate Change and so on. So that is key. But also you need structures to facilitate implementation. For example, structures for facilitating implementation of energy efficiency incentives and programs and so on. So that remains a key challenge for most developing countries that needs to be taken into account. Of course, subsidies remain a key, especially for the demand side sector, where a lot of citizens wants to shift to renewable energy, solar water heaters or PV systems. But government needs to come in and provide the subsidies to assist with that. Of course, also very important is the need for grid investments so that we create an enable environment to scale up the implementation of renewable energies. If you couple that with the need for public-private partnerships, so that allows for government to just create an enabling environment for deployment. We have success stories, for example, in South Africa, in terms of deployment of renewable energies, where we had a renewable energy procurement program. So government did not have need to spend a lot of money in investing, but they created the enabling environment and also put a small stimulus to get the program going. So these are some of the novel policy options that could be considered for that. And again, of course, for developing countries, one of the key challenges is reaching remote communities. Again, the need for investments in smart grids is an important consideration that must be considered as well. Also, the just energy transition offers an opportunity to think about how to green the response and the recovery in general. So again, as you would know, for most countries, some are seriously considering phasing out of large-scale carbon-intensive assets such as power stations. So there's an opportunity there to green such infrastructure where you do repurposing or rehabilitation of the land, or repurpose with renewable energies. Again, if you couple that with a renewable energy procurement program, you could in fact deal with that convincingly. Then another important consideration is the idea that one needs to look at a systematic approach to greening an economy. So that's when one needs to look at a value chain assessment of a particular sector. So for example, the idea in some countries of alien invasive species that can be removed to create biomass that could be used for energy or feedstock, for example, in sectors like ferroalloys or iron and steel companies, helps to deal with the recovery, creation of jobs, and new industries, small-scale industries that would otherwise wouldn't have thought about. But at the same time, it helps us in terms of greening our response to these challenges. So those are some of the aspects that I would like to highlight. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your reflections. We have about 5 minutes left in this panel, so before I let you go, I was hoping if I could just ask you a question on long-term strategies, which is, as you know, very likely to be of critical focus in this coming year, particularly at COP26. I'd like to hear just again, very briefly, but what are your thoughts on how countries can balance long-term strategies with or long-term goals with emergency needs today? Let me go to you first, Helen.
Thanks very much, Bernice. Very briefly on this, I think it's absolutely essential that they look at these together, right? And in fact, what we need to look at, we need to sort of triangulate what we're doing on the economic recovery now to build back or build forward, what we're doing in terms of climate commitments for 2030, the medium-term strategies, and then the longer-term strategies to 2050 or so, what you're doing on climate. In the past, we've tended to develop quite separately in silos the climate and environment plans on one hand, and on another hand, the economic and development plans. And what we've seen is that these led to incoherence, right? They conflicted, they led to things like inefficient subsidies, as Mary mentioned at the start. They've led to real challenges. We now need to do them together. There are opportunities to do them well. And actually, interestingly, if you look at what we've seen from some of the countries that have recently announced very ambitious long-term climate targets, we've had China announcing that they will go net zero before 2060, Japan, Korea announcing they will go net zero by 2050. We've had both Colombia and the UK come forward recently with very ambitious announcements for their 2030 climate targets. All of these are framing them in the context of how they do the economic recovery and how the economic recovery can help boost their action towards climate. And in return, their climate targets will help them to do more inclusive, more sustainable, much more resilient economic growth. So I think this is very much, as State Secretary Jaeger mentioned, it's very much, these do go together, they must go together, they can, and looking at them together using the same tools and approaches will be essential to help support countries to realize those opportunities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Helen. And
Bernice, you're on mute, I think.
oh, now I'm not on mute anymore. Sorry, I was going to turn to Mr. Witi to give the perspective from South Africa on the same question.
Thank you very much, Bernice. I'll be also very brief. I think conceptually there needs to be a change in the focus, because generally most countries, when I talk about long-term goals or vision, they look at them from a carbon constraint perspective, for example, saying towards net zero. But also that is okay, but also we need to look at it from what kind of a society we want to see in 2050 and looking at the services that will be relevant by then. For example, if we look at things like mobility, maybe if we vision how do we think about mobility in 2050, then we can work our way backwards. And then the manner in which we couple the two will be, because if we understand how we want to look like in 2050, then the question is, what are the building blocks we put now for us to get there? Then logically, in order to interface the two, then we can incorporate those building blocks into our sectoral policies and make them targets for sectors, to monitor them. And we also assess them against our, short to mid-term targets in terms of the NDC. So essentially, but most of the things Helen has already captured. But I think there's that conceptual idea that we need to look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your really good insights. So with that, I'm going to be moving us on to our third discussion, taking on board what we have heard today already and how can we drive change within the World Bank? More specifically, how can we make sure to engage teams that don't traditionally work on climate? And this is, of course, has been a big part of our work these last few years in the bank, as we've been trying to mainstream and as we call it, get climate into the DNA of our institution. So To share their insights, we have three directors joining us this morning. I have Marcelo Esteban, who's the Global Director of Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment. We're also joined by Louise Court, who's the Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion, and by John Room, who's the Regional Director for Sustainable Development in South Asia. And of course, was my predecessor. He was the Global Director for Climate Change before he took on the job in South Asia. So he's someone who has been doing a lot of thinking and working on this topic, of course. But let me turn to Marcelo first. Marcelo, a green recovery will require close collaboration between ministries of finance and ministries related to sustainable development and climate change. What macroeconomic tools or frameworks can the World Bank provide ministries for assessing and incorporating climate risks into national budgets, whilst also prioritizing an economic recovery from the pandemic?
Thanks so much, Bernice. First of all, let me just say that it is great to be in this event. I mean, this is an important, incredibly important agenda for the World Bank and for the world. Let me start by saying, answering your question, that so far fiscal stimulus policies have not been particularly green, and the COVID-19 recovery could end up reinforcing existing distortions and patterns of growth. To be convinced that ministers need ideas and rigorous arguments proving the benefits of a green recovery. And crises present us with a unique opportunity to think more freely and do our best to create impactful change. We are looking at new ways to inform policymakers on this issue. First, we are providing new empirical evidence of the output and employment impact of green investments and taxes. Some of the previous panelists mentioned that. Estimates of economic multipliers from green investments are most useful for policymakers. Unfortunately, they are very difficult to calculate, particularly for adaptation projects because of lack of data and uncertainties inherent in forecasting climate change. Therefore, we are looking at different approximate approaches as necessary, and those estimates are coming up. Second, nobody wants to raise taxes during a crisis. Initiating a fiscal consolidation when the recovery is still fragile can plunge the economy back into recession. And yet, countries that entered into the crisis with no fiscal space are already facing soaring fiscal deficits and rapidly increasing debt to GDP ratios, a topic that has been, taking a lot of my time recently. In these countries, policymakers must negotiate trade-offs between supporting short-term growth and initiate a fiscal consolidation to restore market confidence and mobilize revenues. For these countries, our preliminary evidence shows that environmental taxation has the least negative impact on income relative to other taxes. It raises substantive revenues while also reducing carbon emissions and local pollution. Third, what about employment? The experience of previous crises, as well as the ongoing displacement of workers by globalization and automation, underscores the critical importance of macro and fiscal planning to guide sectoral policies and active labor market interventions. To be acceptable, environmental taxation must not contribute to displacing more workers, but help their reallocation towards green sectors and projects. We are using a multi-regional input-output model to provide policy insights into several important issues. How a specific combination of green taxes and spending policy can boost output and employment, which industries will be viable and grow in a low-carbon post-COVID future, how many jobs will be created and lost, and which types of occupation and skills will be needed. So that's, in summary, basically the way we are looking at these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you so much. So let me turn to Louise. Louise, from your perspective, what are some of the social elements that the bank should consider when financing projects that try to align climate action with green recovery efforts? And I know that your global practice has been doing a lot of thinking about this recently, so I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernice, for this opportunity. It's great to be at this forum on such a topic and to bring out the social dimensions of climate change. There is no doubt that the human and social impacts of COVID have been devastating. We know to date, 64 million people have been infected, 1.5 million deaths, and 150 million people are estimated to move into poverty by 2021. So the crisis has also exposed deep inequalities across the global world and within countries. They existed before, but they became sharper with COVID. And we all know that climate change is going to further aggravate these existing disparities, with another 100 million likely to fall into poverty, as has been said. And we know that the poorest and most vulnerable communities will also experience some of the worst impacts of climate change, further aggravating these disparities, and that even some of the mitigation policies that will be put in place could hurt the bottom 40%. So clearly there's an urgency to put policies in place that to determine the course of climate change and the future of our lives on this planet. But these policies also need to take into account the impact on people if they're to be sustainable. We've seen that they must also be equitable and just and protect the poor and vulnerable if they are going to be able to be implemented over time and with the urgency that we need. So what to do? First and foremost, get resources to the local level to reinforce communities' own efforts to build resilience and capacity to adapt to climate change. Actually, only 10% of climate finance is prioritized for the local level, where we've seen from COVID, communities are the first order responders and first hit, and yet only getting 10% of the financing. Support is needed to leverage mechanisms that can channel climate finance to the local level. An example is the work we do on community-driven development, where the bank has invested over 30 billion in the past decade, or also devolved climate finance approaches. We're currently working with the government of Kenya to support decentralization of climate finance to support local governments finance community climate action plans. Second, we need to better understand and track the distributional impacts of mitigation policies and strategies to move to low carbon growth. Marcelo mentioned that we need to understand the impact of these green growth policies on overall output and on jobs. But we also need to know whose output, whose jobs, who will get the jobs, the disabled, the indigenous people, the poor, women, ethnic minorities. We need to understand who will be impacted and how the vulnerable will be able to cope. Third, we need to make sure that there's meaningful citizen engagement and participation in climate decision-making to ensure that the green recovery policies have adequate public support and deliver effective results in reducing emissions. This also means putting in place, where necessary, mitigation policies to protect the poor who may be negatively affected by removing subsidies or certain taxation policies. We have seen the results when this doesn't happen. We have seen how popular backlash against low carbon policies can stymie their implementation. Finally, building awareness and political will amongst our clients on the need to address the social dimensions of a green recovery. This is better data on how climate change will affect the livelihoods and well-being of the poor, how mitigation policies will affect different households across the distribution, and what are the economic losses and how we can compensate for this. We also need better communication and in stakeholder engagement efforts. There have been some interesting examples of national dialogues in the UK, Ireland, and France to build consensus around low carbon growth policies. And we've also seen more specific targeted strategies of engagement for the coal mining closures in Chile, India, and South Africa. So here are a few of the ideas that we'd like to take forward and that we are taking forward to address the social dimensions of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, and absolutely right. These are some critical pieces that we need to address in the months and years to come. So thanks for your reflections. So let me turn it to John. Again, John, having previously led the climate change group at the World Bank, and in fact, part of me feels that you should be moderating this session here today. But you're now leading the bank's sustainable development efforts in the South Asia region. So perhaps you can share with us some of the difficulties that the South Asia region is experiencing in making sure that recovery efforts are green and sustainable, and how can the bank tailor its support accordingly? And I guess to some extent, what we're asking you is, can you give us a bit of a reality check in terms of what is happening on the ground to make some of these efforts happen? So over to you, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Bernice. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. I'm going to make, I could go on forever as you suggest, but I'm going to make 3 simple points and 1 implication. So what are the 3 simple points? First of all, we have to recognize that right now, most of our clients and people in these countries are drinking from a fire hose. They have been slammed by climate change. Revenues are down, demands on expenditure are up, and just at a very mundane level, many of our counterparts have COVID or their families have had COVID. At the same time, and in parallel with this, we talk about building back better, greener recovery. In many of these countries, what governments are focusing on is short-term survival and response. That's what the package looks like. As they're beginning to think about building back, they're beginning to think about this, and they're beginning to think about building back greener. So balancing the short term between this immediate pressure and the medium term, longer term issues, because these longer term issues are clearly there, they're clearly recognized. So we have tried to give countries a little bit of space, recognizing this constraint, but over the last couple of weeks and months, the opening is there now to bring this medium-term agenda back onto the radar screen of our counterparts, and people are now beginning to engage about what it means. So phasing the short term with the medium term. Second point, focus on the win-win. If you look at what we've been able to do on the climate agenda over the last 6 to 9 months, it's been focused on development gains that also have a climate benefit. Just yesterday, we approved a solid waste and anti-flooding project in Karachi and a SIND resilience program. That was done because of the impact of floods in the city of Karachi, okay? It has a climate co-benefit, which is very important. In Afghanistan, we're trying to strengthen the social safety net to get COVID relief out. We're going out to 9,000 communities with support. But that mechanism and strengthening that mechanism is exactly what's going to be needed in order to respond to droughts in the future. On agriculture, because the agriculture system has been strained, there's a dialogue of improving the agriculture system. And part of that goes into the fertilizer policy, for example, in India, which is creating a dialogue that brings a win from what people are dealing with now in agriculture, but also brings us this climate opportunity. And I could go on, Bangladesh, Delta, all the rest of it. But the point is that the point of entry is on economic gains and benefits now and bringing the climate with it. Third point is, how do we get the focus on the big transformational things? I think if you talk, people will talk, we do some trees here, we do a little bit of climate here, a little bit of climate there. But if you have a look at what is needed in South Asia, there are a few really big thorny issues. Number one, the social adjustments to get out of coal. Number two, dealing with cooling, which can bring huge benefits, but if we get it wrong, it's going to have a huge problem. Number three, greening the financial markets. In South Asia, we haven't even touched it. Okay, introducing, as Marcelo said, carbon and environmental taxes, green buildings. There are a few of these things that are really big and meaty. Now, what gives me hope is that South Asia has done a number of these things in the past. They put the early warning systems in for disasters. And you know a lot about this, Bernice. They built the shelters in Bangladesh. They did the light bulbs in India to make those energy efficient. Okay, I could go on and on. It has been done. The question is, how can we accelerate these big sets of issues? And on these big sets of issues, and the ones that I talked about earlier, there are two common characteristics. The one is these require multi-sectoral solutions and multi-stakeholder solutions. The public sector can't do it alone. It takes public, private, citizens engagement, working together to address them. Secondly, the technical solutions and the theoretical economic benefits are pretty clear. The question is, number one, how do you build these stakeholder groups to deliver on these big, bold things? And number two, particularly on the ones that I've outlined here, how do you address the political economy issues? There are we might get benefits in the long term, but there are costs in the short term. And some people win and some people lose. In aggregate, more people win. We've got to be able to address these issues. And then just The implication and the little plug, because of the focus on this event. If you think about what I talked about earlier in terms of revamping agriculture, revamping social security systems, revamping cooling, green bonds, this is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. It requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of investment, a lot of technical assistance. And this is why I'm actually so pleased to see this climate support facility being launched and introduced, because I think this will give us a mechanism to deal with some of these detail level issues in a wholesale efficient way that will deliver on these bigger picture wins that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with you more, of course. And particularly, I think the focus, as you said, sometimes we need to look beyond, okay, plant a few trees here, plant a few trees there, and really think on what are the 2, 3, 4 absolute priorities that we need to focus on that that are going to be transformational. And again, we very much hope, of course, as John just mentioned, that the climate support facility is going to be there to help bank teams and to help our government, our clients, to move along this path. So again, let me thank you, my 3 colleagues from the World Bank, and for this panel. I'm afraid we're out of time for the second question, so I'm going to jump straight to our closing conversation. I'm really pleased for our closing panel to introduce Mr. Harold Weiglein, who is the Director General for Economic Policy, Financial Markets and Custom Duties at the Austrian Ministry of Finance. And our second speaker, Mr. Vel Ganendran, who is the Director of Climate and Environment at the UK Foreign Office, Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO. And our very regular counterpart in discussions on getting ready for COP26. So thank you both for joining us this morning, and may I ask you to offer concluding comments. So first question, I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Weiglein. Could you share your thoughts on how Austria has been able to work with other countries to ensure economic recovery packages are sustainable and inclusive?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much also for inviting me here and being able to listening to some very interesting contributions. On Austria, you know, we're a small country. We can't really aim for big things that we like to do on our own. But what we like to do is to build on the expertise of others, like the World Bank, who is world-class in technical advice and helping countries with climate change policies, and then so build on the expertise of others and insert our own policy priorities. And here I have to say, in Austria, sustainable politics, green transition, all these issues have been very big on the political agenda for a long time. I'd say even for decades. I mean, we had a referendum on the use of nuclear energy in the 1970s, which was thoroughly rejected at the time. And it was seen at the time as the beginning of the green movement in Austria. And that's now a long time ago. And these policies are actually mainstream in Austria. And we have this set of government policies with clear sustainable priorities. And we take the same priorities and use them in our work in international financial institutions, in development policy, and in our multilateral fora in which we engage, first and foremost, the European Union. And now, I mean, the European Union also shares many of our own priorities. And it was mentioned before that we have to look, when we confront COVID, the challenges of the pandemic, there are actually 2 stages that we need to consider. There's, first of all, the short-term response, where we need to deal with the most urgent issues. And these often don't have anything to do with climate change. They are about provision of medical services, vaccinations and things like that, short-term working schemes. But there will be a second stage, and this is now a clear European Union policy that the second stage, which will be about the recovery, must make sure that the recovery will be a green one, it will be sustainable, and it must also be a digital one. And these are policy elements on which we very much agree and that we support. And some of the examples here, where we also talk about development assistance, for instance, the Team Europe initiative, which includes a 3.3 billion European Union response package to Corona for the Western Balkans. Then there's the call for the green and digital transition in the European Commission's economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans region. I have to say the Western Balkans, of course, is historically a very important region for Austria. We share a lot of history together. And maybe I should also mention our newest initiative, the one that has actually been launched here too, where we as Austria join the World Bank to support the Western Balkans via a special window in the climate support facility with an amount of 6 million euros. And we call it the Western Balkans Green Recovery Program, which I think is very fitting for what it's supposed to do. And what is it supposed to do? We want to incentivize the green recovery, that is to say the second stage, with a special focus on, first of all, improving air quality, but also supporting the Western Balkans in implementing the national determined contributions.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Wijklein. And again, also just, of course, you know, our great thanks to Austria for supporting the climate support facility, particularly through this program for the Western Balkans. So with that, let me turn to Vel. Vel, you'll be the final speaker of this morning session. And again, of course, also thanking the UK for supporting our climate support facility. But as the UK will be the host of the COP26 next year, how do you think that ambition can be raised on green recovery efforts and long-term strategies in the lead up to the conference in Glasgow? Really particularly giving the perspective of the COP presidency here. Over to you, Vel.
Thanks, Bernice. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening even to whoever's on the other side. And thanks to you, Bernice, and to colleagues at the bank for organising this panel and also for launching the Climate Support Facility. And I'm delighted the UK can be part of that. On your question, Bernice, how do we raise ambition? I mean, it's a really difficult one. But when I think about this, I think about it in three areas. I think about politics, time, and money. And we've touched on each of those in the panel today. But I just wanted to say a few things. Firstly, on politics, John said it really well when he talked about countries being slammed by the pandemic and focusing on survival, I thought. So actually the recovery is quite a long way off for some of these countries. But when they do think about it, how do we make sure green recovery is part of that conversation? And I think that has to be part of the political conversation. And I had just three reflections on that. The first is creating a political upside. And as many of you will know, we are hosting the UK with France and the UN, hosting Climate Ambition Summit on Saturday to mark 5 years on from the Paris Agreement. And that really is about ambition. How do you create a race to the top where countries want to be demonstrating their progress on this? And I very much hope we'll have some new commitments on long-term strategies and NDCs there. It was a similar kind of approach we took with when the UK with Fiji, Rwanda and the EU led the Sustainable Recovery strand of the Financing for Development process of the UN. So it's all about creating a political upside for countries. On the flip side, we need to deal with some of these perceptions that green is more expensive. John and Helen spoke a lot about how the economics are moving, how we need to invest in just transition. So I won't probably dwell on that, but I do think we need to not pretend those counter arguments aren't there and ignore them, but actually take them on and talk about them. And my last reflection on the politics is just that I think what's happening over there in the US is a great example of what can happen when the politics changes and how things can change very suddenly. So that's first part of ambition. First part of raising ambition is the politics. The second is time. So when countries want to get their economies moving, they want to get it moving quickly, right? And so that means we need to be thinking about these policies now. In the UK, when we announced our 10-point plan on a green industrial revolution, some of those policies were months, even years in the making. So that one of the reasons we really wanted to support the CSF is to be able to deploy that kind of technical expertise really quickly to support countries, because we know that time is going to be the essence. And then the last thing is money. And I thought Mari talked about this really well in terms of the fiscal pressures on countries, the lack of fiscal space to take any climate action themselves. I think it's great the MDBs are front-loading resources, but there are a bigger set of fiscal space issues. We know we all talk about debt being sort of first and foremost among some of those, and certainly as presidency, we're looking to think about that full spectrum of fiscal issues. With that, Bernice, I'm very conscious of time, so I will hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Val, and thanks for your reflections. And with that, we are indeed completely out of time. So I really want to just take this opportunity to thank all of you, to all of our panelists, as well as everyone who took the time to join us virtually today. Again, it's been recorded, and we can, other people can watch the session at another time if they would like. But again, just to say, we really hope that you will stay tuned in the weeks and months ahead to learn more about the Climate Support Facility, which we really see as a cornerstone for the bank's increasing ambition on climate change in the years ahead. So watch this space. And many thanks again to all of our panelists.